Before I begin, a brief note for you listening. The names you're about to hear are chosen at random, so the story is easier to follow. The real names, the exact addresses, and the identifying details were deliberately withheld even in the versions I first received. That is not done to make this more dramatic. It is done because real people lived through this, and some of them are still living with what they saw. There are stories that arrive with noise, police reports, shouting neighbors, the kind of chaos that leaves broken glass on the sidewalk and sirens in the air. And then there are stories that arrive quietly. No blood on the doorstep, no smashed furniture, no frantic calls about someone threatening harm. Just a family in the middle of winter asking for help because the man they love has not slept. Not he can't sleep well, not he's restless, not he's been up a couple nights. He has not slept at all. I first heard this account years after it began, through a chain of people who did not have any reason to exaggerate it. A nurse who had transferred hospitals, a priest who had been asked to consult, a set of notes that never belonged in any public file. I remember the tone more than the words. It was the tone people use when they are embarrassed to say something out loud because it sounds impossible, but they're past the point of worrying about how they'll sound. They were worried about whether he would still be alive by morning. This took place in Duluth, Minnesota, in the kind of winter that doesn't just feel cold, it feels heavy. The air stings, the streets look scrubbed clean, and then immediately punished by another layer of ice. In a place like that, people measure time by practical things. Shifts at work, how long a car will idle before the engine complains, whether the furnace is holding up, whether the lake wind is biting hard enough to make you keep your head down. The man I'm calling Michael was a dock worker, a dependable, ordinary kind of life on paper, the sort of guy who didn't chase attention. He wasn't wealthy, he wasn't famous. He had a routine that made sense. Work, family, sleep, until the sleep stopped. At first, his wife thought it was stress. Long nights on the docks will do that. The body gets confused, the mind won't shut down right away. You stare at the ceiling, you replay conversations, you hear phantom noises. People talk about insomnia like it's a nuisance, like it's just an inconvenience you can fix with a warm drink or a different pillow. Michael's wife tried those things, so did he. But the nights kept stacking up, and something about him didn't match what you expect from a man who hasn't slept. He wasn't stumbling around like a drunk. He wasn't slurring his words. He didn't look like he was fading, at least not at first. He was alert, too alert. His eyes had that shine you see in someone who has been running on adrenaline for too long. But he wasn't jittery. He could hold a conversation. He could remember details. He could tell you what he ate for lunch 3 days ago, what the weather was like, which truck backed into which bay. Then, around the end of the first week, his family noticed something else. He began to arrange the nights. That might sound like a strange way to put it, but it's what the nurse later described. He didn't simply stay awake. He managed his wakefulness like a defensive strategy. He kept the lights on. He kept the television low. He avoided quiet rooms. He avoided closing his eyes. He sat upright in a chair until dawn and then went to work as if nothing had happened. When his wife tried to persuade him to lie down, he didn't argue. He didn't snap at her. He just looked at her as if she'd asked him to do something dangerous. Not unreasonable, dangerous. By the time his family involved the police, the number of days was already far beyond what anyone expects a human body to tolerate. The call wasn't made like a crime report. It was made like a plea. The officers arrived expecting, drugs, maybe, a domestic situation, someone hallucinating, lashing out. They walked into a modest home and found a man sitting at the kitchen table, hands folded, like he was waiting for them. The oddest part, they said later, wasn't that he looked exhausted. The oddest part was that he looked prepared. He spoke politely. He answered questions. He gave his full name. He gave his date of birth. He told them his occupation. He told them he had not used stimulants. He told them he had no history of psychiatric hospitalization. He told them he had no reason to lie. And then, when one of the officers, trying to keep it simple, asked him why he wouldn't just sleep, Michael said something that snapped the temperature of the room down by about 10 degrees. "If I sleep, it will wake up." That sentence does not sound like a medical symptom. It sounds like a belief. It sounds like a superstition. It sounds like the kind of thing you dismiss until you're standing in front of someone who says it without theatrics, without a smile, without the gleam of someone enjoying attention. He said it like he was reporting a fact. At the hospital, the story became even harder to file away. The staff did what responsible staff should do. They checked vitals. They ran tests. They looked for obvious causes, substances, neurological issues, endocrine problems, the kind of things that can drive severe insomnia. They asked about caffeine. They asked about energy drinks. They asked about anything he might be taking over the counter. They asked about work injuries. They asked about trauma. Michael kept giving the same answer. And yet his body did not behave like it should have after that many nights. His heartbeat was steady. His blood pressure wasn't spiking out of control. His speech was coherent. His memory was sharp. He wasn't collapsing into micro-sleeps the way most people would. He didn't have that heavy, drooping face. He was pale, yes. His skin looked dry. His eyes were red around the rims, but he could focus. The nurse who later shared this with me said the physician on duty pulled her aside and whispered something like, "This doesn't make sense." Not as a dramatic line, more like a man admitting to a wall that is still standing after it should have fallen. They tried to get him to rest in a monitored room. They offered medication carefully, because you don't just sedate someone without good reason, especially when you can't pinpoint the cause. They explained the risks. The body needs sleep. The brain needs sleep. The heart needs sleep. They told him that staying awake that long could kill him. Michael listened respectfully. Then he asked them a question. "If you put me under, will you stay with me?" The staff thought he meant, "Will you monitor me?" And of course they said yes. Monitors, cameras, staff nearby. They do that every day. But Michael didn't mean machines. He meant presence. He meant a person. Someone awake, someone watching, someone who wouldn't leave him alone in that room with his eyes closed. When they tried to reassure him, he said it again, more quietly, as if he didn't want to say the words too loudly and give something the satisfaction of hearing them. "If I sleep, it will wake up." At some point, a social worker or a chaplain, someone in that system who had seen enough grief to recognize spiritual fear, asked if Michael wanted a priest. Sometimes that's offered because people feel calmer. Sometimes it's offered because a hospital knows there are things medicine can't touch directly. Most people either accept politely or decline. Michael didn't hesitate. He said yes, but then he added, "Not for last rites." He added, "For rules." Rules is an interesting word to use. Not help, not comfort, not prayer. Rules. As if he understood there was a structure to what was happening, and he needed someone who could recognize it. In the days that followed, because yes, the days kept following, Michael's family began to describe changes in him that weren't dramatic in a Hollywood way, but were far worse because they were subtle and believable. He became more watchful. He started listening to the house the way people listen when they think they hear footsteps outside. He flinched at silence. He avoided mirrors. He would stare at his own reflection like he was checking for something behind his eyes. And still he would not sleep. People think fear makes you frantic. Sometimes it does. Sometimes fear makes you disciplined. Michael became disciplined. He timed things. He kept himself occupied. He cleaned. He reorganized. He kept his hands busy. He spoke less, as if talking was a luxury. When his wife begged him, not for her sake but for his, he would take her hand and hold it for a long time, his grip too steady for a man who should have been shaking, and he would say, "I'm sorry." Not, "I'm fine." Not, "You're overreacting." "I'm sorry." That's the word a man uses when he believes something bad is inevitable and he can't stop it. The police, at the beginning, tried to treat it like a wellness situation. They checked in. They made sure there were no threats, no weapons, no immediate danger. They suggested follow-ups. They did what they could, But they also did what people always do when faced with something they can't categorize. They began to look away. The hospital did what it could medically. The family did what it could emotionally. And all of them kept running into the same wall. Michael wasn't asking them to believe in a demon. He wasn't making speeches. He wasn't claiming special powers. He was simply refusing to cross one thin line, the line between waking and sleep, because he believed something was waiting there. The first priest who spoke with him, again, I'm using priest loosely here because I wasn't in the room, heard Michael's account and responded like many good priests do when the situation is unclear. He prayed with him. He offered scripture. He offered calm. He did not leap to conclusions. He did not label it. He did not feed the fear. And still, when the priest left, Michael stayed awake. When he was asked later what he felt at night, he didn't describe nightmares. He didn't describe shadows crawling on the ceiling. He didn't describe voices screaming at him. He described something far more unnerving. He said that each night, at the same hour, he heard a sound, a knocking, not from the door, not from the wall, not from the window, from inside his own chest, a steady knock, patient, almost polite, as if something were tapping from the other side of him, counting. He said it didn't speak, it didn't threaten, it didn't bargain, it just knocked. And the longer he stayed awake, the clearer it became. The way a dripping faucet becomes unbearable when the house is silent. When he told the medical staff this, they did what they could with it. Some thought heart irregularities, some thought stress responses, some thought he was experiencing somatic symptoms from sleep deprivation. They listened for murmurs. They watched monitor lines. They tried to find a physical rhythm that matched the sound. But the way Michael described it wasn't like hearing his heartbeat. He described it like hearing someone else's, a rhythm that did not belong. And here is where the story starts to turn from strange into dangerous, even in its earliest phase, because Michael wasn't the only one who became aware of time. Everyone around him did. They started to watch the clock. They started to dread a particular hour the way you dread an anniversary of loss. They started to measure their own nights against his, and the family who had first asked for help because he wouldn't sleep began to realize that the real issue was not that he couldn't, it was that he wouldn't, that he was resisting sleep like it was a doorway, and he was standing in front of that doorway day after day because he believed he was keeping something on the other side from stepping through. That's where part one ends, and that's where the question begins. What exactly was he hearing at that hour? And why did he believe sleep would wake it up? When people hear a story like this, they often imagine a sudden turn, a jump, a scream, something unmistakably supernatural that forces everyone in the room to agree on what they're dealing with. That isn't how this progressed. What followed was slower, and because it was slower, it was far more convincing. After the hospital realized they couldn't force rest without consent, Michael was sent home under observation. Follow-ups were scheduled, instructions were given, warnings were repeated. Everyone involved understood the same unspoken truth. If this continued much longer, his body would fail whether he wanted it to or not. But Michael didn't go home to recover. He went home to stand guard. By then, the nights had taken on a structure that everyone in the house could feel, even if they didn't talk about it. Evening meant tension. Late night meant vigilance. And early morning just before dawn meant waiting. Michael stopped lying down entirely. He stayed in a single chair in the living room, positioned so he could see both the hallway and the front door. Lamps stayed on, not bright, not harsh, just enough to break the darkness into shapes he could recognize. Darkness, he said, wasn't the problem. Stillness was. His wife later said that what frightened her most was not his refusal to sleep, but the way he listened. He didn't listen like someone afraid of a noise outside. He listened like someone waiting for a signal, like a man who knows the rules of a game he didn't agree to play. Around the same time, Michael began insisting on something that, on its own, would have seemed harmless. He did not want to be alone, not during the day, not during the night, not even in the bathroom. if it could be helped. He didn't panic when he was by himself, but he tensed. His breathing changed. His attention narrowed. When asked why, he gave an answer that unsettled everyone who heard it. "It doesn't like witnesses," he said. Again, not dramatic, not whispered, just stated. He explained it this way. When someone else was present, the knocking didn't stop, but it stayed distant, fainter, as if whatever was producing it knew it was being observed indirectly. But when he was alone, truly alone, it drew closer. That was the word he used. Closer, not louder, not faster, closer. And then, one morning, after a night when the knocking had been especially persistent, Michael did something that marked a shift from fear into something else. He went back to work. Everyone advised against it. His wife begged him not to. The doctor was clear that continuing night shifts could be lethal, but Michael insisted, not out of pride or denial, but out of something that sounded like obligation. "If I don't go," he said, "it has more room." That sentence didn't make sense to anyone else. To him, it did. The docks were loud, mechanical, unforgiving. Steel, engines, warning, alarms, wind off the water. During the night shift, silence was rare, and for a while, that worked in his favor. He stayed on his feet. He stayed moving. The knocking retreated into the background noise, like something forced to wait its turn. But exhaustion is not fooled by routine. By the second week back on the job, coworkers noticed changes. Michael wasn't making mistakes, but he was slowing down in odd places. He would pause mid-task, head slightly tilted, as if listening for a sound no one else could hear. When spoken to, he would respond immediately, almost too quickly, like he'd been pulled back from somewhere. One coworker joked that Michael looked like a man who hadn't blinked in days. No one laughed. The first physical sign came quietly, a nosebleed, not dramatic, not sudden, just blood on the back of his hand when he wiped his face. He stared at it longer than necessary, then cleaned himself up and went back to work. After that, the nosebleeds became regular. Then came the gaps. Michael began losing minutes, not hours, not entire nights, minutes. He would find himself standing in a different part of the dock without remembering how he got there. He would realize a task was finished without recalling doing it. When questioned, he grew unsettled, not confused, but disturbed by the implication that his body was continuing without his full awareness. He told his wife one night, "It's testing the edges." That was the first time he used the word "it" without being prompted. Around this time, his shadow became a problem. That might sound absurd, but it's exactly how it was described to me. Michael started avoiding strong overhead lights because they cast his shadow too clearly on the walls. He didn't like the way it lagged when he moved. He didn't like the way it seemed to stretch toward him instead of away. When asked why that bothered him, he said something that still makes my stomach tighten when I think about it. "It practices with that first." The family tried to convince him to take leave from work. His doctor wrote a recommendation. They thought, reasonably, that rest, even forced rest, might reset something. But there was another man in this story, a man with authority over Michael's nights. His supervisor. I won't spend much time describing him because he doesn't deserve mythology. He was not possessed. He was not cursed. He was not manipulated by dark forces. He was simply cruel in a familiar, bureaucratic way. He dismissed Michael's condition as exaggeration. He accused him of faking to avoid work. He reminded him repeatedly that night shifts were mandatory and that absences would be noted. Michael tried to explain not the knocking, not the fear, just the fact that he hadn't slept. The supervisor laughed and said everyone was tired. That was the moment, according to those who knew Michael well, when something in him changed. Not outwardly, inwardly. Michael stopped trying to be understood. He stopped arguing. He stopped explaining. He complied. And compliance, in this case, became fuel. The nights grew longer. The knocking grew more confident. It began to synchronize with moments when Michael's attention slipped, when his eyes lingered too long on a dark corner, when his mind wandered for a fraction of a second. One night, driving home after a shift that had stretched longer than planned, Michael realized he had no memory of the last several miles. He was parked outside his house, engine still running, hands on the wheel. Inside his chest, the knocking was no longer steady. It was expectant. When his wife asked what was wrong, he didn't answer right away. He sat down in his chair, pressed his palms together, and said something that marked the true escalation of the case. "It's learning my schedule." Shortly after that, the supervisor was found dead. It happened in the dock parking lot during the early morning hours. No witnesses, no signs of a struggle, no robbery. His neck was broken cleanly with a force that surprised the medical examiner. Michael was working that night. Michael had access. Michael had motive, if you were looking for one. Michael had no memory of the hours in question. When police came to speak with him, he didn't resist. He didn't deny being there. He didn't insist on his innocence in the way people usually do. He listened, and then he said something that made one of the officers step back from the table. "I think it used me," he said. "Not I did it, not I blacked out. Used." Michael explained carefully that the knocking had stopped for a while that night, completely. A silence so sudden it felt like pressure leaving his chest. And in that silence, he felt calm, heavy, compliant. The next thing he remembered clearly was standing under a bright light, hands aching, with no sense of how he got there. The police did what they could with that information, which is to say, not much. There was no evidence tying Michael directly to the act, no witnesses, no footage, no clear timeline. Suspicion lingered, but suspicion is not proof. Michael was released, but something else was released with him. After that night, the knocking returned with a new quality. It wasn't patient anymore. It was irritated. Michael began speaking to his own reflection, quietly, as if negotiating. He slept in even shorter bursts of stillness, never closing his eyes fully, jerking awake whenever his head dipped too far forward. And then came the moment that changed who was watching him. A night nurse, assigned during one of his hospital check-ins, noticed something everyone else had missed. Michael didn't tremble when the room was dark. He trembled when he closed his eyes. And when she asked him to describe what happened in that instant, just that instant, he said something she never forgot. That's where it reaches. That nurse would later be the one to ask for help that medicine could no longer frame. And that is where the story moves next. Because until then, everyone involved was reacting. What followed was the first attempt to understand what rules, if any, this thing was obeying. By the time the nurse reached out for help beyond the medical chart, the situation had already crossed a quiet threshold. Not the kind marked by sirens or headlines, the kind marked by exhaustion. She did not call because she believed Michael was possessed. She called because she believed the rules everyone else was using no longer applied. She had worked night shifts long enough to recognize delirium, panic disorders, trauma responses. She had seen patients unravel under far less strain. Michael was not unraveling, he was narrowing. When I was later told about that call, it stood out to me not because of what she said about him, but because of what she said about the room. She said the room felt wrong only when his eyes were closed. Lights on, lights off, monitors humming, doors open, it didn't matter. The air stayed normal until that brief moment when his eyelids lowered, then something shifted. Not dramatically, not violently. The atmosphere tightened. She described it as the sensation you get when someone steps too close behind you and you can't see them yet, that instinctive awareness that space has been breached. She said she felt watched, but not by Michael. That was enough for her to seek counsel. The priest she contacted was not known for exorcisms. He was known for caution, for refusing to label things prematurely, for insisting that fear alone could create convincing illusions, and that faith demanded patience before action. That priest listened. He did not interrupt. He did not dismiss. He did not reassure her with easy phrases. When she finished, he asked only one question: when does he shake? She answered honestly, only when he closes his eyes. That question changed the direction of the case, because possession, in the traditional sense, does not wait for sleep. It does not require consent through exhaustion. It does not depend on the thin line between awareness and surrender. Whatever this was, it obeyed a narrower law. The priest requested to see Michael, not for a rite, but for observation. Michael agreed immediately, not because he wanted help, because he wanted confirmation. When the priest entered the room, Michael studied him the way a man studies someone who might be standing between him and an oncoming vehicle. With hope, yes, but also with urgency. The priest did not begin with prayer. He asked Michael to describe the first night he heard the knocking. Michael closed his eyes for half a second, then stopped himself. He answered without looking inward. He said it began as pressure, like a second heartbeat that didn't match his own. At first, he thought it was stress, then anxiety, then imagination, but pressure doesn't count time. Imagination doesn't arrive on schedule. This did. Every night, same hour, same rhythm. The priest asked what happened if Michael tried to sleep through it. Michael swallowed. He said he never had. The priest asked why. Michael said because it leans in. That phrase was repeated later in several notes, always the same. Leans in, as if the thing were not rushing, not attacking, but inclining closer when invited. The priest asked another question. What happens if someone else stays awake with you? Michael said the knocking stayed farther away. The priest asked, what happens if you're alone? Michael hesitated. Then he said, it practices. No elaboration, just that word. Practice implies intent. Practice implies preparation. The priest asked Michael to do something simple. He asked him to lie back and close his eyes, not to sleep, just to close them for a few seconds while he remained in the room. Michael agreed, reluctantly. The moment his eyes shut, his breathing changed, his hands clenched, his jaw tightened as if resisting pressure. The priest later said he felt it too, not a presence, not a voice, but a change in proximity. Like standing too close to the edge of something unseen. Michael opened his eyes abruptly. He was sweating. It moved, he said. The priest did not ask where. He asked, did it stop when you opened your eyes? Michael nodded. That was when the priest understood that whatever they were dealing with did not want consciousness gone completely. It wanted it loosened. That distinction matters. From that point forward, the approach changed. No one tried to convince Michael that nothing was happening. No one told him to just rest. No one attempted sedation without witnesses. Instead, they tested a hypothesis. Michael would not be left alone, ever. He would be monitored not just by machines, but by people, awake people, present people, eyes open. The idea was not to confront the thing directly, but to deny it the condition it required. They wanted to see what would happen if sleep occurred without solitude. The first night of this experiment was long. Michael lay in a hospital bed, lights dimmed but not dark. 2 staff members remained in the room. The priest stayed nearby, not praying aloud, not provoking, simply watching. Michael did not sleep. He drifted, and in that drifting state, his body reacted violently. His muscles seized. His breathing became shallow. His voice changed, not in volume, not in tone, but in placement, as if the words were coming from behind his teeth instead of from his chest. He said, he must not sleep alone. Not shouted, not growled, stated. The staff member nearest the bed stepped back instinctively. Another felt lightheaded and had to sit down. The room temperature dropped enough to be noticeable, enough that someone reached for a blanket without thinking. The priest spoke calmly. He did not address the voice. He addressed Michael. He called him by name. Michael's eyes snapped open. The symptoms receded. That night ended without resolution. But it confirmed something crucial. This thing did not want isolation interrupted. It did not want witnesses. It did not want sleep supervised. That made it different from possession. And that difference would later determine the choice that nearly killed Michael and saved him at the same time. Over the following days, Michael's physical condition deteriorated rapidly. His heart rhythm began to falter. His coordination slipped. His immune system weakened. The human body can endure many things, but sleeplessness erodes it from the inside out. Everyone involved knew they were running out of time. And that is when the most dangerous decision was made, not to expel, not to confront, but to force rest. The priest explained it plainly. If the thing fed on the threshold between waking and sleeping, then denying sleep entirely had only stretched that threshold wider. The longer Michael stayed awake, the more territory it gained. Exhaustion was not protection anymore. It was invitation. The only way forward was to close the door fully. That meant sleep. Real sleep, deep enough to collapse the space where the thing lingered. But sleep alone was forbidden. So they prepared a different kind of night. People stayed. Lights remained. Prayers were said quietly, not as commands, but as anchors. Michael was warned of the risk. He agreed anyway. He said, "I'm tired of holding it back." When the moment came, his body resisted violently. His heart rate spiked. His breathing stuttered. One nurse panicked and collapsed under the strain. Alarm sounded. The room felt smaller, colder. Michael's heart stopped. For a stretch of time that no one present would later agree on exactly, then it started again. When he woke, he was crying, not in terror, in grief. He said, "It's angry." He said, "I slept." Michael lived for months after that night. He slept, not well, not peacefully, but he slept. The knocking never returned. What returned instead was weakness, organ failure, the long cost of a body pushed too far. Before he died, he spoke to the nurse who had first noticed the rule everyone else missed. He told her something she carried with her ever since. It didn't die, he said. It just moved on to someone who's tired. That is where this part ends. Not with victory, with warning, because years later, in other places, with other names, people began reporting the same fear, the same resistance to sleep, the same sense that something waited on the other side of rest. And none of them knew Michael's name. They didn't need to. The rules were already in place. After Michael's death, there was a pause, not closure, a pause. The kind that comes after a storm when people step outside, look at the damage, and realize the sky is quiet, not because the danger is gone, but because it has moved. The official cause of death was physical collapse, organ failure compounded by prolonged sleep deprivation. That was accurate. It was also incomplete. The chart closed. The bed was reassigned. The room was cleaned. Hospitals are very good at moving forward. What lingered were the people. The nurse who had noticed the rule no one else saw transferred departments. She did not request night shifts anymore. When asked why, she said only that she preferred daylight. She never explained further, but she developed a habit of checking on patients who sat upright too long, eyes open, listening. The priest who had consulted on the case did not write it up as a possession. He did not submit it for review. He kept his notes private because he knew how easily something like this could be dismissed or worse, sensationalized. Instead, he shared it quietly with other priests, with chaplains, with people trained not to chase demons, but to recognize patterns. That is how I heard about it. Not as a headline, not as a warning, as a story passed carefully, with the kind of restraint that tells you the speaker is afraid of getting it wrong. When I first read the account, what struck me was not the fear, it was the specificity. Evil, when it exists, does not need to be creative. It only needs to be precise. The most dangerous things do not overwhelm. They exploit a narrow opening and widen it slowly. This one required exhaustion. It required isolation. It required that particular human moment when control slips, but awareness hasn't vanished yet. The threshold, for a long time after Michael's case, there were no similar reports. That, too, is how these things behave. They wait. Then, years later, fragments began surfacing, not connected, not identical, but familiar, a factory worker in another industrial city who insisted on sleeping with the lights on and a radio playing, not for comfort, but to keep it busy. A long-haul driver who abandoned his route because he said he could hear a rhythmic tapping behind his ribs every time he closed his eyes at rest stops. A college student who developed the terror of naps not night sleep, naps because he said something leaned closer when he drifted during the day. None of them used the same language, but they described the same structure, the same rule. I want to be very clear here. This is not to say every case of insomnia is spiritual. It is not. Most are physical, psychological, situational. Exhaustion alone can produce frightening experiences. Fear can teach the brain to invent threats, but sometimes, rarely, something else rides on top of that exhaustion, something that does not cause the tiredness, but waits for it. What made Michael's case distinct was not the presence of a named entity. The name came later, secondhand, from older texts and whispered traditions. Names are tools, not truths. What mattered was behavior. It did not attack when confronted. It did not thrive in chaos. It did not seek attention. It sought permission through fatigue. And it did not break the body immediately. It preserved it just enough. That detail should unsettle you, because destruction is easy. Maintenance is intentional. I have been asked many times why a formal rite was not performed earlier, why prayers of command were not used, why no one tried to expel it outright. The answer is simple. You cannot evict something that is not fully entered. This thing lingered in the doorway. Commanding it would have required acknowledging a presence that was feeding on acknowledgement. Provoking it would have narrowed the threshold in the wrong direction. Instead, the decision was made to close the door entirely. Sleep, not drifting, not hovering, sleep, and that nearly killed Michael. People sometimes ask me whether that choice was right. I tell them this: Michael died months later, yes, but he did not die in that doorway. He died whole. Whatever followed him did not stay. That matters, because what moved on did not move on with him. It moved on alone. There is one final detail from this case that rarely gets mentioned because it does not fit neatly into any category. In the weeks after Michael's death, his wife reported that the house felt different, not calmer, emptier. She said the nights were still quiet, but the quiet no longer felt occupied. The chair where Michael had kept watch was just a chair again. The hallway was just a hallway. She slept. For the first time in months, she slept. That is not nothing. If you're listening to this and feeling uneasy, that's appropriate. Not because you should be afraid to sleep, but because you should understand how valuable rest is. Exhaustion is not just a physical state, it is a spiritual vulnerability. It strips away discernment. It narrows perception. It makes false rules feel necessary. And sometimes it invites attention. Michael believed he was protecting others by staying awake. In a way, he was. But he paid for that belief with his body. If there is a lesson here, and I am careful with that word, it is not about demons hiding in dreams. It is about what happens when a human being is pushed beyond endurance and told to keep going anyway. The most dangerous evil does not announce itself. It waits until you are too tired to argue. It waits until closing your eyes feels like surrender. And then it leans in. That is where this chapter ends. Not with fear, with vigilance, because whatever you believe about the source of this story, the conditions that allowed it still exist. People still work through the night. People still carry impossible loads. People still believe rest is weakness. And something, somewhere, is always willing to take advantage of that. Sleep is not the enemy. Isolation is. Remember that, and do not face the night alone. There is a temptation, after hearing a story like this, to look backward and feel safe, to say, that happened then, to someone else, under circumstances I will never face. That temptation is understandable. It is also dangerous, because what followed Michael's case was not a single echo, but a pattern that only became visible when you stopped looking for spectacle and started paying attention to fatigue. The next report I encountered did not come through a hospital. It came through a confessional. A man sat down and did not confess a sin. He confessed a schedule. He spoke about working double shifts, about sleeping in fragments, about never being alone because being alone meant the thoughts grew louder. He did not mention knocking. He did not mention fear at first. He said only that he was afraid to close his eyes because something always felt closer afterward. I asked him the simplest question I know how to ask in those moments. How long has it been since you rested without setting an alarm? He couldn't answer, not because he didn't want to, because he couldn't remember. That is where these stories begin again and again. Not with demons, with calendars, with time cards, with people who believe they can push through one more night. When I listened carefully to the fragments that followed Michael's case, I noticed something that disturbed me more than any single account. The entity, if we use that word at all, never introduced itself. People did. They gave it language, shape, meaning, but it never asked for a name. It did not tempt. It did not threaten. It waited. And it waited in a place every human being must pass through eventually. Sleep. What Michael encountered was not a predator in the open. It was something adapted to thresholds. You should understand what that implies. Thresholds are not destinations. They are transitions. They are moments when attention loosens, when identity softens, when the will releases its grip just enough to rest. Every tradition understands this, even if they explain it differently. That is why so many cultures treat sleep with ritual, with community, with care, and that is why isolation is so effective. Michael's belief that he was holding something back was not entirely wrong, but his mistake was believing he could do it alone. The human body is not designed to be a gatekeeper. It breaks quietly. By the time someone realizes they are no longer choosing wakefulness, they are being driven by it. That is when discernment fails. That is when everything feels necessary, even suffering. After Michael's death, I made a point of asking different questions when people came to me describing fear at night. I stopped asking what they saw. I started asking how tired they were. I asked who was with them. I asked whether anyone else knew what their nights looked like. And in doing so, I avoided several situations that could have gone very wrong. I will tell you one of them. A woman in her early 30s, working healthcare during a staffing crisis, long hours, rotating shifts, no consistent sleep. She began hearing a soft tapping sound only when she drifted on the couch after work. She told herself it was pipes. Old buildings are noisy, but the sound followed her when she moved. She did not feel threatened. She felt accompanied. That distinction matters. When I spoke with her, I did not tell her she was in danger. I did not speak of spirits. I did not suggest anything supernatural. I told her to stop sleeping alone. I told her to tell someone when she rested. I told her to anchor herself in routine that involved other people being present. Within days, the tapping stopped, not because something fled, because the condition it required was gone. This is not a victory story. It is a prevention story, and prevention rarely feels dramatic. Michael did not have that option. By the time his case reached the point of intervention, the threshold had been stretched too long. The cost of closing it was catastrophic, and yet it worked. That should tell you something. The final months of Michael's life were quiet, not peaceful, quiet. He slept, but lightly. He avoided being alone at night. He deteriorated physically, but he did not describe fear the way he once had. The urgency was gone. That suggests that whatever had been present did not survive full rest combined with human presence. It did not die, but it moved on, and it did not linger where it was denied access. People often want to know whether these things can be destroyed. That is the wrong question. The right question is whether they can be starved of isolation, starved of exhaustion, starved of secrecy. Michael's final warning was not mystical, it was practical. It moved on to someone who's tired. That sentence should trouble you more than any name ever could, because tiredness is common. Tiredness is celebrated. Tiredness is worn like a badge of honor. And in that culture, thresholds widen everywhere. I am not telling you this so you will fear the night. I am telling you this so you will respect it. Sleep is not surrender. Sleep is restoration. What preys on the threshold does not fear sleep itself. It fears sleep shared, protected, witnessed. That is why the instruction Michael spoke under strain was so revealing. He must not sleep alone, not because the thing cared about him, because it cared about access. This is where I leave the story for now, not with a conclusion, but with a responsibility. If you are exhausted, do not isolate yourself. If you are afraid to sleep, tell someone. If the night feels crowded when your eyes close, open them and make sure someone else is there to see you do it. Whatever you believe about the source of these accounts, the pattern remains. Fatigue narrows the soul, presence widens it again, and nothing that depends on secrecy survives being seen. That is not theology. That is observation, and it may be the most important thing Michael ever taught us. There is something else that needs to be said, and I say it now because people often misunderstand silence. They think silence means absence. Sometimes silence means restraint. After Michael's case, I chose not to speak about it publicly for a long time, not because I doubted what I had heard, and not because I feared judgment. I stayed silent because stories like this can do harm when they are told too quickly, too loudly, or to the wrong ears. Fear spreads faster than understanding, and whatever lives on thresholds feeds just as easily on imagination as it does on exhaustion. So I waited, and while I waited, I listened. I listened to what people did not say out loud. I listened to the way they described their nights without using words like terror or evil. I listened to the pauses in their sentences, the way their voices dropped when they talked about closing their eyes. What I noticed over time was this: no one ever came to me saying, "Something is attacking me in my sleep." They came saying, "I'm afraid of falling asleep." That difference is not semantic, it is structural. Fear of sleep itself is not natural. Fear of what happens while sleeping can be. Nightmares, trauma, anxiety, those have clear roots. But fear of the act of letting go, of crossing that line at all, points to something else. It points to distrust of rest. Michael trusted nothing except wakefulness. By the end, that trust became his armor. And like all armor worn too long, it cut into him. There is a moment in prolonged exhaustion when a person stops feeling tired and starts feeling hollow. They are still moving, still speaking, still making decisions. But something essential has thinned. That thinning is what makes thresholds dangerous, because thresholds are not places of strength. They are places of transition, and transition is always vulnerable. When people ask me now how to recognize when exhaustion has crossed from ordinary into dangerous, I give them a rule that has nothing to do with demons. I ask them whether rest feels forbidden, not inconvenient, not difficult, forbidden. Michael describes sleep the way someone describes a locked room they dare not open, not because of what they might find inside, but because of what might step out. That is not insomnia. That is vigilance taken too far. And vigilance, when it becomes permanent, distorts perception. One of the most overlooked details in Michael's story is that the knocking was never chaotic. It was orderly. It respected time. It respected rhythm. It respected routine. That alone should tell you something important. Whatever was present did not want to disrupt his life. It wanted to inhabit it quietly, without drawing attention. It waited until his schedule was rigid, until his nights were predictable, until his fatigue was reliable. Only then did it press closer. Evil that seeks spectacle is easy to spot. Evil that seeks permission is harder. Michael's case ended with his death, but the pattern did not end with him. I have since spoken with people who never heard knocking, never felt pressure, never sensed a presence, yet still lived on the edge of the same threshold. They described a feeling that sleep would cost them something: productivity, control, safety, identity. That belief alone can hollow a person out. You do not need a spirit to destroy yourself that way. But if something else exists that takes advantage of that belief, it does not need to create it. It only needs to wait. Michael believed he was keeping something back for others. That belief gave his suffering meaning. Meaning is powerful. Meaning can sustain a person long past their limits. That is why his decline was not sudden. It was disciplined. I want to speak now to something that is rarely addressed in stories like this: responsibility. When Michael's supervisor ignored his condition, when systems demanded more than his body could give, when fatigue was treated as weakness instead of warning those were not neutral choices, they were contributing factors. If something waited for exhaustion, those choices prepared the ground. I say this because it matters where we place blame. Michael did not invite what followed him. He endured it. And endurance is not the same as consent. When we tell stories about evil, we like to isolate it from ordinary life. We like to imagine it as something foreign, external, dramatic. Michael's story refuses that comfort. It took place in kitchens, hospitals, parking lots, workplaces. It grew in the space between shifts. It fed on silence and dismissal. That is far more unsettling than any ritual gone wrong. I have been asked whether the thing Michael encountered was unique. I do not believe so, but I do believe it is limited. It does not roam freely. It does not overpower. It requires cooperation from circumstances, and that means they can be prevented, not through confrontation, through care, through community, through respecting the limits of the human body and spirit. If you are listening to this and thinking, I've felt something like that, do not jump to conclusions. Do not name it. Do not challenge it. Do not fixate on it. Fix it on rest. Fixate on presence. Fixate on being known. Isolation is the great amplifier of fear. It turns whispers into declarations. It turns sensations into certainties. Michael's final months taught me that presence is not passive. It is active resistance. People staying awake with him did more than any prayer could have done alone. Not because prayer is weak, but because prayer is meant to be embodied. We are not meant to face thresholds alone. Sleep is a communal act in its healthiest form. Even when we sleep alone in a room, we do so within a web of relationships, routines, and trust. When that web breaks, the threshold widens. Michael's warning was not poetic, it was observational. Whatever moved on after him did not seek the strongest person, it sought the most tired. That should reframe how we think about vulnerability. Strength is not the opposite of weakness. Sometimes strength is knowing when to stop. If this story leaves you unsettled, let it unsettle you in the right way, not toward fear of the night, but toward respect for rest, toward checking on the people who never stop moving, toward questioning systems that reward exhaustion, toward refusing the lie that collapse is noble. Michael did not lose because he slept. He lost because he was forced to stay awake for too long. And if there is one thing I would want you to carry with you after hearing this, it is this: anything that tells you that you must endure alone is lying to you. Whatever waits on the threshold cannot cross it when you are not by yourself. That is not superstition, that is pattern. And patterns, once seen, can be broken. There is a final layer to this story that I have not spoken about yet, because it is the part that is easiest to misunderstand. People often assume that when something ends quietly, it has ended completely. Michael's case did not end loudly. There was no public reckoning, no official warning issued, no category added to a manual. The world absorbed his death the way it absorbs thousands of others every year by moving on. But those who were close to the case noticed something subtle in the months that followed. Not manifestations, not events, absence. The hospital where Michael spent his final weeks reported fewer night incidents for a time. Not fewer emergencies, those never stopped, but fewer panic episodes tied to sleep. Fewer patients insisting on staying awake without being able to explain why. Fewer reports of dread attached specifically to closing one's eyes. It was as if a pressure system had passed through and left the air temporarily calmer. That did not last. Pressure systems never disappear. They relocate. What returned first was not fear. It was language. People began using the same phrases without knowing where they came from. I don't want to be alone when I sleep. I need someone nearby. Something feels closer when I drift. These statements appeared in different mouths, different cities, different circumstances, no shared background, no shared beliefs, no shared stories, but the same structure. That is how you know you are not dealing with imagination alone. Imagination is creative. Patterns are efficient. When I speak to groups about discernment now, I emphasize this point carefully. Do not obsess over identifying what something is. Ask instead what it requires. Michael's case taught us that clearly. It required fatigue. It required solitude. It required prolonged vigilance, framed as responsibility. It required a person willing to sacrifice themselves quietly. Those conditions still exist. They are encouraged. They are rewarded. They are praised. That should trouble you, because it means the doorway is never fully closed. It simply narrows or widens based on how we live. There is a reason ancient traditions insisted on communal rhythms. Shared meals, shared rest, shared prayer, shared silence. Those were not just cultural habits, they were safeguards. When those safeguards erode, thresholds appear everywhere. I want to tell you about one more encounter because it clarifies something essential. A man came to me years after Michael's case, convinced that something followed him. He had read too much, listened to too many stories. He was afraid he had inherited something unseen. I did not ask him what he thought it was. I asked him how he lived. He worked nights. He slept during the day, alone, phone off. He had no regular contact with others outside of work. He believed independence was strength. I asked him to change nothing about his beliefs. I asked him to change his habits. Within weeks, the fear receded, not because something was banished, because the conditions collapsed. That is the part of this story that makes people uncomfortable. There is no dramatic ending, no definitive enemy, no clean resolution, just an ongoing responsibility. Michael's experience forces us to confront something we prefer to ignore. Not all dangers announce themselves, and not all victories look like triumph. Sometimes survival looks like learning when to stop. Sometimes faith looks like asking for help. Sometimes resistance looks like rest. I am aware that some people listening to this will want a name. They will want to categorize what Michael encountered. They will want to know whether it was demonic, psychological, symbolic, or something else entirely. I understand that impulse. Names make us feel in control, but names also limit our attention. If you call something a demon, you stop looking at work schedules. If you call it stress, you stop listening to fear. If you call it imagination, you stop caring about patterns. Michael's story refuses to sit comfortably in any one explanation, and that may be its purpose. What matters is not what it was. What matters is what it did. It exploited exhaustion. It withdrew from presence. It avoided confrontation. It required consent through collapse. Those traits tell you more than any label ever could. As I bring this chapter to a close, I want to speak directly to you, not as a priest, not as a storyteller, but as another human being who has watched people break quietly. If you are tired, truly tired, do not treat that as a personal failure. If you are afraid to rest, do not carry that fear alone. If someone you love is always awake, always working, always holding things together, check on them. Not later. Michael did not need someone to fight for him. He needed someone to stand with him. And when that finally happened, it changed the outcome, even though it did not erase the cost. The most chilling part of this story is not that something moved on. It is that it could move because there was always another tired person, another isolated person, another quiet sacrifice. That means the responsibility does not end with this story. It passes to us, to how we care for one another, to how we value rest, to whether we believe anyone should endure alone. Whatever waits at the threshold cannot cross it if we refuse to widen it. And that refusal is not heroic. It is ordinary. It looks like presence. It looks like stopping. It looks like letting someone sleep without fear. That is the lesson Michael left behind. Not a warning carved in stone, a pattern revealed in flesh, and patterns once recognized lose much of their power, because awareness is not confrontation, it is containment. That is where I will stop, not because there is nothing more to say, but because the rest of this story is not mine to tell. It is lived every night in the choices we make when the world goes quiet. Do not face that quiet alone.